In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to replace the cranks on a bicycle. So this video will specifically be focusing on the square taper style of cranks like these, which have a square hole in the middle, which corresponds with a square bottom bracket spindle. Bicycle cranksets are sold in a wide variety of different configurations, including different numbers of chain rings, different sizes of chain rings, and different lengths. In my case, I'm swapping the cranks on this bike with these ones which are shorter and have smaller chain rings, which should be more suitable for the type of riding that I'm planning on using this bike for. As you'll notice, the bike that I'm demonstrating on today is a recumbent bike, but the procedure for doing this job is exactly the same as it would be if I was doing it on a conventional bike like this one here. Since I'm planning on using my existing pedals with my new cranks, my first step is to remove the pedals from the bike. I have a whole separate video on YouTube which deals with pedals, which I've linked below, so for the interest of time in this video, I'll fast forward through this step. Alright, so now with both pedals removed, we can proceed with removing the cranks. The procedure for removing cranks is the same for both the right and left cranks, but I'll be starting on the left crank this time. So the first step for removing this old crank is to take off the fastener which holds it in place. In my case, that fastener is hidden behind this plastic dust cap here, so my first step actually is to remove that plastic dust cap, which can be done very easily with a slotted screwdriver. With that dust cap removed, I can now see what type of fastener is used for holding these cranks onto the bike. Some cranks are fastened using a 14mm nut like this, while others are fastened instead using a 14mm bolt. There's also some cranks which are held in place with bolts which look like this, which are instead removed using an 8mm Allen key. So find the appropriate tool which fits the fastener which your bike has. In my case, that's a 14mm socket. These fasteners have a standard right-handed thread, which means if I want to remove them, I rotate in the counterclockwise direction. I find it easiest to work on these by placing the crank so that it's at the bottom of its pedal stroke like this, and then placing my tool on there so that it's slightly to the left of the crank, which allows me to put both hands on here like this to be able to get really good leverage by squeezing my hands together to undo that bolt, which is sometimes on there really tightly. So with both hands on here, I'll squeeze these together like that. And that was able to loosen it off, and now I should be able to remove it the rest of the way with my fingers. So although this fastener was the only thing which was securing this crank onto the bike, if you just try and pull on it, you'll discover that this crank is still very tightly held in place. The way that this system works is the bottom bracket spindles have a tapered end, and the hole that it goes into is also tapered. So when these two parts are mated together, and there's a fastener pulled from this end when it's being installed, those two surfaces become very tightly wedged together. To be able to unwedge the cranks, there's a special tool called a crank puller. These usually sell for around $20 or less, and you should be able to buy one from your local bike shop. The crank puller that I normally use is this all-in-one tool, which has a crank puller on one side and a 14mm socket and Allen key on the other side, which are necessary for doing the first part of the job that I already demonstrated. Just to make things a little bit easier to see, I'm going to remove this part of the tool for the rest of the video. So the crank puller tool has these large outer threads, which correspond with the threads which surround this square hole in the crank. So the crank puller gets threaded into there. And after that's been done, then this middle part, you would start to spin it, and watch carefully this end here. You'll notice that something starts to protrude from there, right there. So in the middle of the tool, this part is poking through, and what that does is when this has been installed in there, that middle part is pressing on the inside of that hole there on that square, and it's pushing the bottom bracket spindle back out of the hole. Before I thread this tool into my crank, I want to make sure that that middle part has been fully retracted so it won't interfere. So now I'll proceed with threading this into here, being very careful to put it in so that it's perpendicular, so that it's not going to get cross-threaded. Now to get this in there very tightly, I'm going to use this built-in wrench that comes with my all-in-one tool, but if you use the other tool which didn't have that, you can instead just use an adjustable wrench to do that. So you want to get it on there so that it's fairly tight to make sure that these threads are properly engaged. So now we'll move on to twisting this middle part here, which I can start doing by hand. Once it starts to get hard, I would then move on to using a wrench, but in this case I'm going to use my built-in wrench instead. So just move that from one hex to the other. And you can see that it's kind of hard for me to twist here now, so I've got to use some force. In order to help me get better leverage on this, I'm going to rotate it up like this so that I can push on these and use gravity to help me apply force here. You'll feel it start to move, which means it's starting to unwedge itself. And it'll eventually start to get easier. And then you should be able to pull it off just like that. So now that this crank is fully removed, I can take the crank puller off of it, and that's done by placing the wrench onto this part of the tool and rotating it counterclockwise. Like so. The procedure for removing the right crank is exactly the same, but before doing so I recommend shifting the front derailleur into its smallest chain ring and then picking up the chain and moving it from the chain ring onto the frame here so it won't get in our way. So now that I've got both of the old cranks removed, I can proceed with installing my new ones. Before doing that, however, I would recommend giving this area of the bike a quick cleaning, just because normally when you have cranks on there, you don't really have very good access to that part of the bike. If you'd like to know more about how to take apart and service a bottom bracket, I have a whole separate video on that topic. The procedure for installing the new cranks is quite simple. I just place this square hole over the square spindle. Then I take the fastener which I took off the bike earlier and put it inside the hole and rotate. To tighten it down, I once again use my 14mm socket. The force that's required here is fairly substantial, since what I'm doing is wedging those two surfaces very tightly together. So once again, I'm going to stand up and use my body weight to apply the force. Eventually you'll find that you won't be able to rotate this any further, and that means it's been pressed on as far as it can go. To protect those inner threads for the next time that I need to put a crank puller on this bike, this dust cap gets inserted in there just simply by pressing on it. The procedure for installing the right crank is exactly the same, but be sure to install it on the bike so that it's perpendicular to the left crank. So now with both my cranks in place, I can install my pedals into them. Again, I'll fast forward through this part, but you can watch my other video linked below on this topic. So now that the installation of the cranks are complete, I can pick up the chain and place it on the smallest chain ring. One final step that you might need to do after replacing your cranks is recalibrating your front derailleur. These two screws here are called limit screws, and they control how far from side to side your front derailleur is able to travel. Since the geometry of your new cranks might be different than your old ones, you might need to make some adjustments to these screws. In my case, not only are my new cranks have a different geometry, but they also have a different size of chain rings, which means I probably also want to make an adjustment to my derailleur in its position on this post here. So in my case, I probably want to move it down since I have smaller chain rings on my new cranks. Another thing which you might need to adjust is the slack in your front derailleur cable, particularly if you have a bike which has index shifters like this one does. The intricacies of making adjustments to a front derailleur goes beyond the scope of this video, but I've linked to another video below which provides the full details. But anyway, that concludes this tutorial demonstrating how to replace the cranks on a bicycle. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.